What happens when one simple act of kindness collides with the most dangerous underworld in America? When a single sandwich becomes the thread that unravels decades of secrets, loyalty, and blood. This is the story of Emma Martinez, a 32-year-old waitress from Queens, New York, whose ordinary Tuesday afternoon would lead to an encounter that would change everything she thought she knew about mercy, justice, and survival. On September 14, 2023, at exactly 1:47 p.m., Emma made a decision that took 3 seconds. 3 seconds to hand her brown bag lunch to a hungry child outside her diner. By 6:15 p.m. that same evening, 5 black SUVs would pull up to her apartment building. By 6:22 p.m., she would be face-to-face with Vincent Calabrese, the most feared crime boss in the tri-state area. A man whose name made federal prosecutors lose sleep. A man who hadn't been photographed in 11 years. A man who controlled everything from the docks of New Jersey to the penthouses of Manhattan. But here's what nobody expected. Here's what the FBI wiretaps wouldn't catch. Here's what would make this case one of the most extraordinary events in modern organized crime history. That hungry boy wasn't just any child. He was the grandson of Vincent Calabrese. And what Emma gave him wasn't just food. According to the old code, the ancient rules that govern the families, she had extended protection. She had offered sanctuary. And in Vincent's world, that debt could never go unpaid. This is a story about what happens when two worlds collide. When innocence meets calculation. When kindness becomes currency in a realm where everything has a price. This is a documentary about the 48 hours that followed that moment, the investigation that would involve 12 federal agencies, the secrets that would emerge from 40 years of silence, and the question that still haunts everyone involved. Was Emma Martinez the most unlucky woman in New York? Or was she the only person who truly understood what power really means? The media got this story wrong. They painted Emma as either a victim or a conspirator. They portrayed Vincent as either a villain or a folk hero. They reduced a complex human interaction to clickbait headlines and social media speculation. But the truth, as always, is more complicated, more nuanced, more revealing about human nature than any simple narrative could capture. This documentary is built on exclusive interviews with federal investigators, sealed court documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests, surveillance footage from 17 different cameras, phone records, witness testimony that was never made public, and one extensive interview with Emma Martinez herself, conducted 6 months after the events in question. What emerges is a portrait of modern America that few people see. The intersection of poverty and power. The collision of old-world values and new-world realities. The question of what we owe each other in a society that increasingly believes we owe each other nothing. Welcome to the true story that the media got wrong. The case files that were sealed. The testimony that was never heard. Welcome to the real story of the day Mercy walked through the front door and the underworld came knocking at the back. Welcome to a story about honor, debt, and the price of kindness in a world that has forgotten how to value it. Queens, New York, September 2023, a neighborhood where 53 languages are spoken within a single square mile. Where the subway rumbles beneath buildings that have stood since the 1920s. Where every block tells a different story, and every story begins with someone who came from somewhere else, looking for something better. This is where Emma Martinez built her life, piece by careful piece, dollar by hard-earned dollar. Emma Martinez was 28 when she first arrived in New York from El Paso, Texas. 4 years later, she had become part of the furniture at Rosie's Diner on Junction Boulevard. Not the manager, not even the head waitress, just Emma, the woman who remembered your order, who asked about your mother's surgery, who slipped extra fries to the construction workers who barely made minimum wage, who worked the early shift starting at 5 a.m. because it meant she could take online college courses in the evening, who had perfected the art of being present without being noticed, helpful without being intrusive, kind without being vulnerable. Her apartment was a fifth-floor walk-up in a building where the elevator had been broken since 1997. The superintendent kept promising to fix it. 26 years later, residents had learned to accept the climb as part of their daily exercise routine. Emma's unit was 600 square feet. One bedroom barely large enough for a full-size bed. A living room that doubled as her study space. A kitchen window that looked out onto a brick wall exactly 32 inches away, close enough that she could see the mortar crumbling between the bricks. Count the layers of old paint, trace the history of the building through its architectural scars. Rent was $1,650 a month, which in New York terms meant she was lucky. Her paycheck, including tips, averaged $12,400 monthly. After rent, utilities that seemed to increase every season, student loan payments that felt eternal, a Metro card, basic groceries purchased with calculated precision, and the occasional necessity like replacing worn-out work shoes, she had approximately $340 left over each month. This was her margin for error. This was her buffer between stability and catastrophe. This was the financial tightrope that millions of Americans walk every single day, one unexpected expense away from disaster. The people who knew Emma would later describe her the same way, with remarkable consistency. Quiet, but not shy. Reliable without being rigid. Kind without being naive. She had worked at Rosie's for 4 years. In that time, she had never called in sick, not even when she caught the flu and worked an entire shift with a fever of 101. Never started drama with coworkers who thrived on gossip. Never complained when she got the worst sections or the difficult customers who seemed to believe that tipping was optional. She had a system, refined through years of discipline. Wake up at 4:15 a.m., no snooze button, no negotiations. Shower cold when she needed to wake up faster. Coffee, black, made in a $20 machine she'd bought at a thrift store. Toast with peanut butter, the cheap kind because organic was a luxury her budget couldn't accommodate. Pack a lunch because buying food in Manhattan was financial suicide. A lesson she'd learned the expensive way during her first month in the city. Walk 12 minutes to the diner, using the time to mentally prepare for the shift ahead. Clock in at 4:58 a.m., giving herself 2 minutes to tie her apron, check her appearance, transform from Emma the person into Emma the waitress. Work until 2 p.m., serving breakfast crowds and lunch rushes, navigating the complex social dynamics of a New York diner where regulars expected recognition and tourists expected entertainment. Go to the library because it was free, climate-controlled, and quiet. Study until 5 p.m., working through business administration courses that promised a future beyond table service. Go home, legs aching, feet swollen. Make dinner, usually pasta or rice with whatever vegetables were on sale. More studying until her eyes burned. Sleep by 10 p.m. if she was lucky, midnight if an assignment demanded it. Repeat. Every day, every week, every month, building toward a future she could barely imagine but desperately wanted. This was her life. unremarkable by most standards, the kind of life that gets lived in millions of variations across this city every single day, the kind of life that never makes the news, never becomes a documentary, never gets remembered by anyone except the people who lived it. The kind of life that politicians reference in speeches but never truly understand. The kind of life that requires more courage, more resilience, more daily heroism than most people recognize. But here's what nobody knew about Emma Martinez. Here's what wouldn't come out until much later, until federal investigators started pulling on threads that led back 27 years, until her background check revealed a history she rarely discussed. Emma had grown up in the foster care system. 13 different homes before she aged out at 18. She had learned early that the world didn't owe you anything, that kindness was rare, that when someone showed you mercy, you remembered it forever. That survival required developing invisible armor, learning to read situations instantly, understanding which adults could be trusted and which ones were counting down the days until you turned 18 and became someone else's problem. She had made herself a promise when she was 16 years old, sitting in her 7th foster home, watching her foster mother throw away a perfectly good sandwich because the bread was slightly stale. The waste had enraged Emma, who had gone to bed hungry more nights than she could count. Emma promised that if she ever had enough, if she ever got to a place where she had more than she needed, she would never let someone go hungry if she could help it. Never. It was a small promise, the kind you make to yourself at 16 when the world seems both infinite and impossible. The kind that feels important in the moment and foolish at 32 when life has taught you that promises are expensive and mercy is complicated. Except Emma never forgot. She carried that promise through every foster home, every disappointment, every setback. It became part of her identity, part of how she measured her own worth. To understand what happened next, you need to understand Vincent Calabrese. And to understand Vincent Calabrese, you need to understand that organized crime in America didn't die in the 1990s. It evolved. It got quieter, smarter, harder to prosecute. It learned to hide in plain sight, to blend legitimate business with illegitimate operations so seamlessly that even forensic accountants struggled to separate the two. Vincent Calabrese was born in 1968 in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, into a world where loyalty meant everything and weakness meant death. His grandfather had come through Ellis Island in 1923, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and connections to people who would help him survive in a new country that was both welcoming and hostile. His father had been a captain in the Gambino family during the organization's height, earning respect through strategic thinking rather than unnecessary violence. Vincent grew up in a world where business was conducted over Sunday dinners, where handshakes meant more than contracts, where a man's reputation was his most valuable asset. He was groomed for this life the way some children are groomed for Harvard or Yale. Except his education involved different lessons: how to read people in seconds, how to instill fear without ever raising your voice, how to build an empire that left no paper trail, created no digital footprint, operated in the gaps between what was legal and what was provable. By 2023, at 55 years old, Vincent controlled operations worth an estimated $400 million annually, according to FBI estimates that were probably conservative. Construction contracts awarded through relationships rather than competitive bidding. Waste management companies that served half the restaurants in 3 boroughs. shipping operations that moved legitimate cargo alongside shipments that customs agents were paid not to inspect too carefully. Labor unions that ensured certain contractors always got the best workers. Legitimate businesses with just enough illegitimate activity to generate real money, structured so carefully that prosecutors spent years building cases that judges eventually dismissed for lack of evidence. He had been arrested twice in his entire career, convicted never. 53 witnesses had been prepared to testify against him over the years. 14 had disappeared, their families receiving generous payments from anonymous sources. 21 had changed their stories after private conversations about the welfare of their children. 18 had died of natural causes, or what the medical examiners ruled as natural causes. Heart attacks and accidents that happened with suspicious timing, but insufficient evidence to prove otherwise. The FBI had an entire task force dedicated to bringing him down. Operation Clean Sweep had been running for 8 years, consuming resources, generating thousands of pages of surveillance reports, wiretap transcripts, financial analyses. They had enough evidence to write a comprehensive book about his organization's structure and operations, but not enough to put him in prison. Not enough to satisfy the burden of proof that American justice requires. Vincent's most valuable asset wasn't money or muscle. It was his reputation. He was known as a man who kept his word absolutely, who honored the old traditions when most of his generation had abandoned them for quick profits, who valued loyalty above profit, respect above fear. In a world where most mob bosses lived like celebrities, posting on social media, driving expensive cars, wearing Rolex watches they couldn't resist flashing, Vincent lived like a ghost. No social media presence, no photographs except ones that were over a decade old, no public appearances that weren't absolutely necessary. He communicated through intermediaries who understood the importance of discretion. He made decisions from behind layers of protection that made him nearly invisible to surveillance. The U.S. Marshals estimated fewer than 200 people had seen his face in the last decade, and most of those were family members or associates who would die before betraying him. But here's the thing about Vincent Calabrese that the FBI profiles always missed. Here's what the psychologists and the analysts and the prosecutors never quite captured in their reports. Vincent believed in the code, not as a convenience, not as a cover story or public relations strategy, but as a genuine framework for how the world should work, how men should conduct themselves, how obligations should be honored. In his mind, society had broken down because people no longer honored their debts, because loyalty had been replaced by selfishness, because mercy had become weakness and kindness had become exploitation. He ran his organization the same way his grandfather had taught him, with rules that everyone understood, with structure that provided clarity, with consequences that were absolute and fairly applied. You didn't betray the family. You didn't harm civilians unless they created direct threats. You didn't forget when someone saved your life or showed mercy to your blood. And you never, ever forgot a debt of honor. Marco Calabrese was 8 years old on September 14th, 2023. He had his grandfather's dark eyes that seemed older than his years, and his mother's gentle nature that hadn't yet been hardened by the realities of his family legacy. He loved baseball with the passion only an 8-year-old can muster. Collected baseball cards he kept in a binder organized by team and player statistics. He loved video games, especially the ones where you built things rather than destroyed them. He loved pepperoni pizza from the place on Mulberry Street that his grandfather owned, but never publicly acknowledged. He was supposed to be in school that day, sitting in third grade, learning multiplication tables and reading comprehension. Instead, he was 3 miles away in Queens, sitting on a bench outside a diner, trying very hard not to cry, because his grandfather had once told him that Calabrese men handled their problems without tears. Marco's life was complicated in ways most 8-year-olds couldn't comprehend. Shouldn't have to comprehend. His father, Vincent's oldest son Dominic, had been killed in a car accident when Marco was 3 years old. The official report said brake failure on a rainy night. Vincent's investigation suggested otherwise, but the people responsible had disappeared before justice could be administered. His mother Angela had remarried 2 years later to Robert Rossetti, a man who worked in finance at a legitimate investment firm. A man who knew nothing about the family business when they started dating. A man who was slowly, carefully trying to move them away from Vincent's world, trying to give Marco a chance at a normal life, whatever that meant for a child born into this particular family. That morning, Marco had run away from home, not because anyone hurt him, not because of abuse or neglect or any of the reasons Child Protective Services worry about, but because he had overheard his stepfather and mother arguing about his grandfather. His stepfather wanted to cut off contact completely, wanted to move to California where the family name meant nothing, wanted Marco to grow up away from all of this, away from the legacy, away from the danger, away from the weight of a surname that carried so much history and obligation. And Marco, who barely remembered his real father but who loved his grandfather with the fierce loyalty of a child who sees only kindness and attention and stories about family honor, had grabbed his backpack during breakfast and walked out the door while his mother was upstairs and his stepfather was on a conference call. He had $37 in his pocket, money he'd been saving from birthday gifts and allowance, a subway card his mother had given him for emergencies, and a plan that extended as far as getting to his grandfather's house in Brooklyn, which he had been to exactly 4 times in his life, none of which he remembered clearly enough to navigate to on his own, none of which had included memorizing addresses or subway routes. By 1:30 p.m., Marco was lost. He was hungry, having eaten nothing since dinner the previous night because his stomach had been too nervous for breakfast. He had spent his money on the wrong subway line, asking strangers for directions who gave conflicting information or ignored him completely. He had somehow ended up in Queens instead of Brooklyn, 2 boroughs that look similar to adult eyes, but feel completely different to a confused 8-year-old. He was scared but trying very hard to be brave because his grandfather had taught him that courage wasn't about not feeling fear. Courage was about doing what needed to be done even when you were terrified. He sat on that bench outside Rosie's diner for 23 minutes. People walked by, dozens of them. Hundreds in a city that never stops moving. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked if he was okay. This was New York. You minded your business. You kept moving. You assumed someone else would help if help was needed. A kid alone on a bench didn't necessarily mean crisis. Maybe he was waiting for his mom. Maybe his dad was inside getting food. Maybe he was fine. And even if he wasn't, getting involved meant complications, meant responsibility, meant potentially making yourself late for wherever you needed to be. But Emma Martinez, coming out for her break at 1:47 p.m., saw something different. She saw the way Marco kept looking at the diner window with longing that wasn't just about food. The way he clutched his backpack like it contained everything important in his world. The way his foot was tapping against the ground in that particular rhythm that meant anxiety, not boredom. The way he kept checking a phone that was clearly dead. The screen dark no matter how many times he pressed the button. She recognized all of it, had lived versions of it in 13 different foster homes. She walked over, crouched down to his eye level, understanding instinctively that towering over a scared kid would make everything worse. Asked gently if he was okay. Marco, who had been taught never to talk to strangers, who knew all the warnings about trusting adults you didn't know, felt something in his 8-year-old instincts tell him this person was safe. That this woman with tired eyes and a grease-stained uniform and a genuine smile was someone who would help without hurting. He told her he was lost, that he was trying to get to Brooklyn, that he was hungry but had spent all his money on the wrong train. Emma didn't hesitate, didn't ask complicated questions about why he was alone or where his parents were, or whether she should call the police. Didn't perform the mental calculation that most adults make about liability and risk, and whether helping would create problems. She simply handed him her brown paper bag. The lunch she had packed that morning at 4:30 a.m. Turkey sandwich on wheat bread because white bread was cheaper, but less nutritious. Apple, slightly bruised but still good. Granola bar she'd bought in bulk. Bottle of water she'd refilled from the diner's filter. The same lunch she packed every day. The meal that would get her through the second half of her shift and into her evening studying. "Take this," she said. "Eat something. Then we'll figure out how to get you home." Her voice was calm, matter of fact, the voice of someone who had solved worse problems with less resources. Marco took the bag with both hands, the way children do when receiving something precious. Emma sat down next to him on the bench, close enough to be present, but not so close that he'd feel crowded or threatened. She asked his name, asked where he was trying to go, asked if he had a phone number for his parents, and slowly, carefully, with patience that came from understanding how scared kids communicate, she started to untangle the knot of his 8-year-old crisis. She got him to eat the sandwich, got him to tell her about the argument, got him to share his mother's phone number, which he'd memorized the way kids memorize important things through repetition and songs. She never knew who he was, never asked his last name, assuming it didn't matter for the immediate problem of getting him home safely. Never suspected that this child, sitting on a bench in Queens eating her turkey sandwich, was connected to the most powerful crime family in New York. Never imagined that helping him would create ripples that would extend far beyond this moment, this bench, this simple act of human kindness. She just saw a hungry kid who was lost and scared, and she helped. Because that's what her 16-year-old self had promised. Because that's who she had decided to be in a world that gave her every reason to become someone harder, colder, less willing to extend herself for strangers. That decision, made in 3 seconds without calculation or hesitation, would set in motion a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. Because at exactly 2:13 p.m., while Emma was using her phone to call the number Marco had given her for his mother, leaving a voicemail explaining the situation in calm tones that masked her own confusion about why an 8-year-old was wandering Queens alone, a black sedan was already en route. Vincent's security team, among the best private protection money could buy, had located Marco's phone signal within 18 minutes of Angela reporting him missing. They had been watching on surveillance cameras that covered more of the city than most people realized. They had seen everything. The bench, the woman, the lunch, the conversation, and they had already called Vincent. Vincent, who had been in a meeting about legitimate construction contracts, had left immediately, had demanded every detail about the woman who was sitting with his grandson, had ordered his team to approach carefully, to not scare her, to assess whether she was a threat or an opportunist, or exactly what she appeared to be. And when his team reported that she seemed genuinely concerned, that she had given Marco her own lunch without asking for anything, that she was simply helping a lost child the way any decent person would, Vincent experienced something he hadn't felt in years. Surprise. Not at Marco being found. His security team was too good for that outcome to ever be in doubt. But surprise that someone had helped without knowing who Marco was, without calculating advantage, without seeing opportunity in a vulnerable child. Angela Rossetti arrived at Rosie's diner at 2:47 p.m., having driven from her home in record time, every traffic law forgotten in her panic. She was 41 years old, beautiful in the way that requires both genetics and maintenance, the kind of beauty that turned heads, even in a city full of beautiful people. She drove a BMW that cost more than Emma made in 2 years, wore clothing that carried designer labels Emma recognized from magazines she'd never bought. When she saw her son sitting on a bench, eating what appeared to be the remains of a sandwich, next to a waitress in a grease-stained uniform, she experienced two simultaneous emotions: overwhelming relief that Marco was safe, and absolute terror about what this interaction might mean. Because Angela knew what Emma didn't. She knew who Marco was connected to. She knew what it meant in Vincent's world when a stranger helped his family. She knew about the code, the ancient unwritten rules that govern the families, that created obligations and debts that could last generations. And she knew, with the certainty of someone who had lived adjacent to this world for over a decade, who had lost a husband to it, and was desperately trying to keep her son from being consumed by it, that this interaction wouldn't end here, that Vincent would see this as significant, that Emma had just become visible to a man who noticed everything and forgot nothing. What Emma didn't know as she walked home that afternoon, her lunch bag empty, her good deed done, her mind already shifting to the studying she needed to do that evening, was that she was already under surveillance. 3 different teams, actually, each watching her for completely different reasons, each convinced they understood what her significance meant, none of them aware that the other teams existed. Vincent's security detail had placed her under immediate protection. 2 vehicles rotating in 12-hour shifts, 6 operatives total. Former military, former law enforcement, people who knew how to watch without being obvious. Their orders were simple: observe, protect, document. Report any threats. Report anyone who approached her. Report any behavior that suggested she might be more than she appeared. Because Vincent had learned long ago that coincidences were rare, that people who appeared innocent often had complicated motivations, that you survived in this world by trusting no one until they had proven themselves trustworthy across time and circumstances. The FBI agents who had been following Vincent's associates for months as part of Operation Clean Sweep had noticed Vincent's unusual security deployment. Special Agent Rachel Morrison, the case lead who had dedicated the last 11 years of her career to bringing Vincent down, had received an alert from their surveillance system. Vincent's organization had activated protection protocols typically reserved for family members. But the subject wasn't family, wasn't a known associate, was, according to preliminary database searches, completely clean. No criminal record, no suspicious associations, no red flags anywhere in her background, which made her fascinating, because Vincent didn't waste resources, didn't deploy 6 operatives to watch random civilians, which meant Emma Martinez was significant somehow, and anything significant to Vincent was significant to the FBI. The third team was less official. A freelance investigator hired by Angela's husband Robert, who was desperately trying to document everything related to Vincent's operations. Robert was preparing for a custody battle he hoped would never happen, building evidence that Marco's grandfather was too dangerous to have unsupervised access. He wanted documentation of everything, every meeting, every unusual activity, every indication that Vincent's world was bleeding into his family's life. So when Angela came home shaking, explaining what happened, Robert immediately hired someone to watch Emma, to see if she was part of some larger scheme, to understand whether his stepson had accidentally or deliberately orchestrated this entire situation. By 5 p.m., Vincent knew everything about Emma Martinez that could be found in public records: her address, her employment history, her credit score, which was mediocre but improving, her student loan debt, which was substantial but manageable, her social security number, her medical history from what insurance records could be accessed, her online presence, which was minimal, her social media accounts, which she barely used and contained nothing interesting, her voting record, her parking tickets, all 3 of them paid on time, her high school transcripts from El Paso, everything that left a digital footprint or paper trail, compiled and analyzed within hours. By 5:30 p.m., Vincent knew more than that. He knew about the foster care history, obtained through contacts in social services who could access sealed records for the right price. He knew about the 13 different homes. He knew about the promise she had made at 16, found in a journal entry from a case file about a foster parent accused of neglect. He knew about the friend from foster care she sent money to every month, tracked through Venmo transactions. He knew about her volunteer work at a food bank on Saturdays, documented through sign-in sheets. He knew about her perfect attendance at work, her mediocre but consistent grades at community college, her complete absence of romantic relationships or complicated friendships, or any connections that might create leverage or complications. She was, by every measure Vincent's people could find, exactly who she appeared to be. Someone trying to build a decent life through hard work and determination. Someone who had survived difficult circumstances without becoming bitter or cynical. Someone who kept promises made to herself when she was 16. Someone who helped lost children without expecting payment or recognition. This presented Vincent with an unusual problem. In his world, everyone had an angle. Everyone wanted something: information, money, connection, protection, status, revenge. Everyone operated from calculated self-interest, which made them predictable, manageable, understandable. But Emma Martinez had helped his grandson expecting nothing. She hadn't asked for money, hadn't asked for a favor, hadn't even asked for her name to be remembered. She had given her lunch to a hungry child and called his mother and sat with him until he was safe. Period. No additional agenda, no hidden motivation, no calculated risk assessment. That kind of person was rare, and in Vincent's experience, rare things were either incredibly valuable or incredibly dangerous. He needed to know which category Emma fell into. Needed to understand whether her kindness was genuine or performance, whether she was a threat that needed to be neutralized or an asset that needed to be protected. whether she was working with law enforcement or rival families, or was actually just an ordinary person who had done an extraordinary thing without realizing its significance. He called a meeting with his closest advisors in his private office, a room that was swept for electronic surveillance 3 times daily, where conversations happened with confidence that no recording devices could penetrate the sophisticated countermeasures installed in the walls. His consigliere, Michael DeLuca, had been with him for 34 years, had watched Vincent grow from an ambitious young captain to the most powerful boss in 3 states, had advised him through wars with rival families, federal investigations, internal betrayals, and the evolution of organized crime in the digital age. His head of security, James Torino, called Jimmy by everyone who knew him, had protected Vincent for 22 years, had taken 2 bullets meant for him, had made problems disappear so thoroughly that even federal investigators working overtime couldn't find evidence they had ever existed. His lawyer, Robert Castellano, no relation to Angela's husband, had kept Vincent out of prison for 18 years through legal brilliance and strategic relationship building with judges and prosecutors who understood that some battles weren't worth fighting. Vincent laid out the situation, explained what happened with Marco, explained what they had learned about Emma, asked for their assessment. Should they approach her directly? Should they investigate more thoroughly? Should they simply have someone watch her from a distance and ensure her safety without direct contact? Should they bring her in for a conversation to assess her intentions? Should they offer compensation and hope she accepted it and went away? Should they treat her as a potential threat until proven otherwise? Michael, the consigliere, spoke first. He was 67 years old, gray hair perfectly cut, expensive suit tailored to fit his expanding waistline, voice calm and measured from decades of counseling powerful men through difficult decisions. He said this was a situation that required respect, that Emma had, intentionally or not, extended protection to a member of the family according to the old code, that by feeding Marco, by sitting with him, by ensuring his safety, she had created an obligation that transcended normal business calculations, that refusing to acknowledge this obligation would be an insult to the traditions that gave their organization legitimacy and structure, that every captain, every soldier, every associate would be watching how Vincent handled this, that his response would signal whether the old values still mattered or whether the family had become just another criminal enterprise interested only in profit and power. Jimmy, the security chief, was more cautious. He was 51 years old, built like someone who still trained daily despite years behind a desk. Former Marine with tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, he pointed out that any direct contact would draw attention. The FBI was watching. Any unusual activity around an unknown civilian would trigger investigations that were already aggressive. Questions would be asked, surveillance would be intensified, resources would be deployed, connections would be sought. And even if Emma was clean, even if she was exactly what she appeared to be, involving her in Vincent's world would put her in danger, would make her visible to rivals who would try to exploit the connection, would make her a potential target for people who wanted to send messages or create leverage or simply cause problems for Vincent. Robert, the lawyer, was blunt in the way lawyers can be when speaking to clients who pay them enough to be honest. He said the smartest move legally was to do nothing directly. Send flowers anonymously. Maybe leave an envelope of cash at her door with no identifying information. Express gratitude without creating connection. Maintain plausible deniability. Avoid any direct contact that could be documented by surveillance or testimony. Because any meeting, any conversation, any exchange could be used by prosecutors as evidence of criminal association, witness tampering, or obstruction of justice. The U.S. Attorney's Office would love nothing more than to demonstrate that Vincent's organization was threatening or influencing civilians. Vincent listened to all of them, valued their perspectives, understood their concerns. Then he made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. He said, "I'm going to thank her myself, in person, tonight." The room erupted in immediate objection. Michael tried to explain why this violated every security protocol. Jimmy outlined the risks in detail, his military training evident in his systematic analysis of vulnerabilities and threats. Robert warned about legal exposure, about how a personal visit could be used in future prosecutions, about how breaking his pattern of invisibility would embolden federal investigators. But Vincent was unmoved. He said something that his advisors would later recount to federal investigators under immunity agreements that came years afterward. "She saw my grandson scared and hungry, and she gave him her own food without asking who he was, without wanting credit, without calculating advantage." That's the kind of person the old families were built to protect. That's the kind of person who reminds me why we have rules about honor instead of just rules about profit. I'm going to thank her properly because that's what men of respect do. Because showing gratitude for genuine kindness is what separates us from animals. Because if we can't acknowledge simple human decency when we see it, then what's the point of pretending we're anything more than criminals? His team had 3 hours to prepare. They would secure her building, which meant paying the superintendent for access codes and floor plans. They would clear the street through arrangements with local businesses that owed favors or wanted protection. They would position spotters at every corner to watch for FBI surveillance or rival family observers. They would have escape routes planned for every possible scenario. They would have doctors on standby in case anything went wrong. They would have lawyers ready to respond within minutes if arrests happened. They would plan for every contingency they could imagine, and several they hoped would never occur. And at exactly 6:15 p.m., 5 black SUVs pulled up outside a 5th-floor walk-up in Queens, where a waitress was making pasta for dinner, her textbook spread across the coffee table, her mind focused on an economics midterm she had in 3 days. Completely unaware that her ordinary life was about to intersect with extraordinary circumstances in ways that would change everything she thought she understood about power, protection, and the price of human kindness. Emma was stirring marinara sauce when she heard the knock. It was 6:22 p.m. She wasn't expecting anyone, hadn't ordered food, wasn't waiting for packages. Her friend from foster care sometimes visited unannounced, but she was in Chicago visiting family. Emma approached the door cautiously, the way you learn to approach unexpected situations when you've grown up in environments where surprise rarely meant good news. She looked through the peephole and saw 2 men in dark suits, professional, polite, terrifying in their blank professionalism. The kind of men who look like they could break you in half without wrinkling their ties. The kind of men whose presence outside your door meant your life was about to become complicated in ways you couldn't predict. She didn't open the door. Every instinct from 13 foster homes told her to stay quiet, stay still, pretend she wasn't home. She called through the door, her voice steadier than she felt. "Can I help you?" The taller man spoke. His voice was calm, respectful, almost formal in its precision. He said, Ms. Martinez, my employer would like to speak with you. It's regarding Marco, the boy you helped this afternoon. May we come in? Emma's first instinct was to say no, to call the police, to pretend she wasn't home despite having just answered. But something in the man's tone wasn't threatening. It was formal, almost ceremonial, like he was delivering an invitation rather than a demand. And Emma had learned to trust her instincts about danger. These men weren't here to hurt her. They were here for something else. She said, "Who's your employer?" The man replied, "Someone who wants to thank you properly." "We mean you no harm, Ms. Martinez. But this conversation is important. We'd appreciate a few minutes of your time." Emma made a calculation. The kind you make when you've survived situations where the wrong decision could mean everything. She could refuse, but they knew where she lived. They knew her name. They had clearly been watching. Refusing now wouldn't make them go away. It would just delay whatever this was. And delay, in her experience, rarely made difficult situations better. She opened the door with the chain still attached, looked at both men carefully, saw expensive suits, respectful posture, hands visible and empty, not the body language of people planning violence. She unlatched the chain, opened the door fully, said, "You have 5 minutes." The two men stepped inside. One moved immediately to the window, checked the sightlines with professional efficiency, adjusted the blind slightly. The other stayed by the door, positioning himself where he could see both the entrance and Emma. Then the taller man spoke quietly into a microphone on his wrist. Clear. 30 seconds later, Vincent Calabrese walked into Emma Martinez's apartment, and the air seemed to change. Not with threat, but with presence. The kind of presence that comes from decades of commanding rooms, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives, operating in spaces where weakness meant death and strength meant survival. He was 55 years old but looked younger. Gray hair cut short, precise, expensive, clean-shaven. A suit that probably cost more than Emma's car was worth, tailored so perfectly it looked like he'd been born wearing it. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing that fear is a tool you control, never experience. That power isn't about aggression. It's about certainty, about moving through the world as if it was designed to accommodate you because it was. He looked at Emma, extended his hand, said, "Ms. Martinez, thank you for seeing me. My name is Vincent. I'm Marco's grandfather." Emma shook his hand. His grip was firm but not crushing. Respectful. Her mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening, why this man with bodyguards and expensive suits was standing in her tiny apartment that suddenly felt even smaller. She said, "Is Marco okay? Did something happen?" Vincent smiled. It was a genuine smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and transforms a face. He said, "Marco is perfect, thanks to you. You gave him your lunch. You sat with him when he was scared. You called his mother. You helped a child who was lost, and you asked for nothing in return." Emma didn't know what to say. The intensity of his gratitude felt disproportionate to what she'd done. She managed. Anyone would have done the same thing. Vincent's smile faded slightly. He said, "No, they wouldn't have." 37 people walked past my grandson before you stopped. We counted them on surveillance footage. You were the only one. That means something, Ms. Martinez. That tells me something important about who you are. Emma was starting to feel uncomfortable. She said, "I'm glad I could help. But you didn't need to come all this way to say thank you. A phone call would have been fine, really." Vincent looked around her apartment, took in the small space with assessment that wasn't judgment. The modest furniture bought secondhand or from discount stores, the textbook stacked on the coffee table, spines cracked from use. The kitchen where pasta water was still boiling, the single window with the view of a brick wall. He saw everything, understood everything. Then he looked back at her and said, "May I sit?" Emma nodded, uncertain what else to do. They sat across from each other. Vincent's security stayed by the door and window, silent, watchful, professional enough to be almost invisible. Vincent leaned forward slightly. His voice was serious but not threatening. He said, "Ms. Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you because I believe you deserve honesty. I'm a businessman. I have interests in many industries across this city: construction, waste management, shipping, hospitality. Some of those interests are straightforward. Others are more complicated. I tell you this because I want you to understand what comes next. I want you to know exactly who I am so you can make informed decisions." Emma's stomach dropped. She understood what he was saying without him saying it explicitly. She said, "What comes next?" Vincent held her gaze, said, "In the world I come from, when someone helps your family, when someone shows kindness to your blood without expecting anything, it creates an obligation. Not a debt that can be repaid with money, an obligation of honor, of protection, of ensuring that the person who showed mercy is never harmed because of that mercy." Emma was starting to understand. She said, "I don't want anything from you. I really don't. I just helped a kid." Vincent nodded, said, "I know. That's exactly why this matters. You're not asking for anything, which means what I'm offering comes from respect, not transaction. So here's what I want you to know. From this day forward, you're under my family's protection. That doesn't mean you owe me anything. It means that if you ever need help, if you ever face a problem you can't solve, you have people you can call. And it means that anyone who means you harm will have to answer to me first." Emma stared at him. She said, "I don't need protection. I'm fine. I live a quiet life. I don't have problems that require what you're offering." Vincent said, "I hope you continue to live that quiet life. But the world isn't always fair to people who deserve fairness, so consider this insurance. I'm leaving you a number. If you ever need anything, you call it. Someone will answer. Someone will help. No questions asked, no payment required, no strings attached." He stood up, reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, aware that sudden movements might frighten her, pulled out a business card, set it on the coffee table between them. The card was simple, cream-colored, expensive stock. A single phone number printed in black. No name, no company, nothing else. Vincent said, "I won't intrude on your life again unless you ask me to, but know that my family remembers what you did today, and we won't forget. In a world where most people walk past hungry children, you stopped. You shared what you had. That's rare, Ms. Martinez. That's valuable. That deserves to be protected." He walked to the door, turned back, said, "One more thing. You're studying business administration, correct? At Queen's Community College?" Emma nodded, confused and slightly disturbed that he knew that. Vincent said, "Your tuition is paid. All of it. Through graduation. Consider it a gift from a grateful grandfather who understands the value of education and the struggle of trying to improve your circumstances while working full-time." Emma stood up quickly, said, "I can't accept that. That's too much. I didn't help Marco for payment. I don't want money. Vincent's expression softened. He said, Ms. Martinez, my grandson could have been hurt today. He could have gotten on the wrong train with the wrong person. Could have talked to someone who saw opportunity instead of a child. Could have disappeared into this city and never been found. Every year, hundreds of children vanish. You prevented that. You gave him food and safety and helped him get home. In my world, that's worth more than tuition money. It's worth everything. Emma didn't know what to say. Vincent nodded to his men. They opened the door efficiently, checked the hallway, positioned themselves for his exit. He stepped toward the door, then looked back one final time and said, Thank you for helping Marco. You're a good person, Miss Martinez. This city needs more people like you. People who see someone in need and help without calculating cost or benefit. Then he was gone. The door closed. Emma stood in her apartment, staring at the business card on her coffee table, trying to process what had just happened. The pasta water had boiled away. Her economics textbook lay forgotten. Everything felt surreal. Like she'd stepped into a movie where she didn't know her lines or understand the plot. Outside, Vincent's convoy pulled away. Inside the lead SUV, Michael the consigliere said, That went well. She's exactly what we thought. Genuine, scared but strong, not looking for anything beyond being left alone. Vincent looked out the window at the passing streets, said, She's scared of me. Michael replied,